Raylan, who was standing behind the stunned Frisha and Tam, leaned forward and whispered, "Oh, he's good. I didn't know the tough warrior had that in him."
"Say, Lord Reskin," Malcius spoke up. "Is that your magnificent beast?"
Malcius waved a manicured hand toward Pride, who was standing further down the dock. The reins hung limply, brushing the ground in a silent command for the horse to remain where he was. Pride was nearly as opulent as Reskin today. The stallion's black coat was clean and brushed to a shine. The embossed black saddle and black and silver bridle were polished as well. The horse's mane and tail were braided and woven with silver ribbons in a parade style.
"Why, yes he is. But please, you may dispense with the title. I'm quite sure none of you will forget who I am. Just call me Reskin, although my friends sometimes prefer to call me Rez,"
the young man said with such confidence it was infectious.
"Yes, quite right, Reskin. Rez, it would please me if you called me Malcius as well," the noble replied.
Frisha's jaw dropped. Her egotistical cousin never dropped his title, for anyone. No doubt Malcius thought he would look weak and insecure if he insisted on continuing to use his title after Rez's speech. The announcement was followed by a round of permissions by all to dispense with the titles. In only a matter of moments, Reskin had completely disarmed the nobles of their pretentious snobbery, at least as far as he was concerned.
"You were speaking of the horse?"
Sheila prompted demurely as she batted her lashes.
"Yes. Tell us about the stallion,"
Pallas piped up.
"It is massive. I have not seen the like. The only horse I have seen that comes close is Uncle Markham's."
"What breed is it? Is it of the Chronolis stock?" asked Brant. Reskin grinned like he was holding all of the candy. "No, Pallas is quite right. He is a purebred battle charger of the Augmarian line. I call him Pride." The men's jaws were slack as glances darted back and forth between Reskin and the horse.
But that is the king's stock,"
protested Malcius. Reskin grinned broader as he placed his hands loosely in his pockets and rocked back on his heels in an uncharacteristic display of pride. "Indeed," was all he said. "Speaking of which, it is time I get him rigged so they can haul him aboard. You had best keep your distance. He tends to maim or kill anyone but me." The three male lordlings followed Reskin but kept their distance, whispering between themselves as he removed the saddle and tack and strapped the horse into the harnesses, readying him to be hoisted aboard the ship. The lords looked like children drooling over their new best friend's amazing toy. Sheila's eyes never left Reskin, and every once in a while he would bend or stoop and her face would flush. Frisha had no idea what Reskin was up to. But if he thought for 1 second that she was going to lose him to Sheila, then he had another thing coming. Once everyone was aboard, they received their berth assignments. Reskin already knew the assignments because he had made them himself. The young warrior assigned himself to share a room with Malcius, while Pallas and Brant shared a second. For strategic reasons, Reskin would have preferred to place Tam with Brant, but it would have been considered unseemly for the young lord to share a room with a commoner who was not his manservant. Frisha, Raylan, Sheila, and Sheila's maid Tammy were assigned to share a 4-person berth. Reskin could get away with placing Raylan in the room since she was the only other female on board. As both officers and nobility, Captain Jimson and Lieutenant Draskin shared a berth, and Tam was left to bunk with Sergeant Millens as commoners. The 4 Jabai house guards shared another 4-person room, while the other servants were placed with the crew. The rooms were small and cramped, since 2 or 3 of the berths could possibly fit into a single average room at an inn. When it came to the confines of a ship, it seemed the nobles preferred privacy over space. Malcius looked around and wondered, "Where are the rest of my belongings?" Reskin laughed. A sound that would have seemed unnatural to anyone who knew him, but sounded genuine and effortless to the unsuspecting lord. "I don't know about you, but I would prefer not to sleep on a trunk." Reskin waved a dismissive hand at the 2 trunks that had been placed at the ends of their respective beds. "I believe we only need 1 in here at a time. The rest are stored in the hold below. If you require something, I'm sure one of those crewmen will be delighted to retrieve it for you." In order to keep up appearances, Reskin was also traveling with several trunks. It would have looked odd for a noble of his unspecified but presumably high standing to be traveling with nothing more than a single pack and saddlebags. So far, no one was willing to risk offending him by questioning his place within the ranks of the nobility. Since the crew had situated their belongings and Rezkin had already seen to Pride, there was little to do. He and the other passengers found themselves standing on the deck waiting to depart. The women approached the huddle of young men. All three wore sour expressions, but Frisha and Raylan stood back as Sheila sidled up in exasperation. Malcius grinned and said,
"Ah, sister! So nice of you to join us."
Sheila batted her lashes at Rezkin, to whom she directed her answer.
"Nothing could keep me away,"
she said with syrupy sweetness. Rezkin bowed slightly and inquired with a pleasant smile,
"Lady Sheila, how do you find your accommodations?"
Sheila's composure slipped as she fanned her face with a lacy hand and fluttered her eyes with overly dramatic distress.
"Well, I am sure that little can be done, but it is most disconcerting to be sharing a room with a bunch of commoners."
The disdain with which she said the word commoners made it sound as if she had been assigned a room filled with livestock. Rezkin's smile dropped, and he directed an uncertain and disapproving frown in Malcius's direction, while flicking a glance at Frisha. Malcius flushed at the unspoken rebuke. As General Markham's heir, Frisha was due all the respect of the nobility, and to demean her publicly was unbecoming behavior for a lady. Rezkin's comportment as a nobleman of the highest standard encouraged Malcius to uphold the standard as well. Malcius cleared his throat as he gave his sister a penetrating look.
"Sister, I'm sure you misspoke."
Sheila was startled by the reprimand and glanced over to see Rezkin's disapproving stare. She blushed slightly and replied,
"Oh, yes, I meant a couple of commoners and our dear cousin. Forgive me, Frisha, I meant no offense,"
she said with feigned regret. Frisha rolled her eyes and crossed her arms.
"I'm sure you didn't," she remarked. "I must say, Sheila, I find myself greatly concerned for your well-being," she said, her brow furrowed with worry.
Sheila's eyes widened in trepidation of some unidentified threat.
"Why is that?" "I had not realized your constitution was so delicate that the mere presence of other human beings could render you so senseless," Frisha remarked fretfully. "I worry that this journey could cause you an inordinate amount of stress. Perhaps you should reconsider attending."
Raylan snickered behind her hand as she held back a giggle, but Pallas and Brant burst out laughing. Even Malcius wore a sly grin, which immediately fell when Sheila scowled in his direction. Sheila's face reddened, and she turned her attention to Rezkin. He observed the young lady with a somber face, but a glint of laughter in his eyes. Sheila knew the handsome nobleman was watching to see how she would react. The heat slipped from her cheeks as she grinned wickedly. She sidled up to Rezkin and wrapped her arms around one of his muscular biceps as she turned to face Frisha. She then gazed up at the young warrior with doe eyes and said sweetly,
"I am sure, dear cousin, that I will be quite well during the trip. From what Uncle Markham said, Rezkin here is quite capable. I will be in good hands."
Rezkin lifted a brow and cast a feral grin down at the young woman. Frisha was fuming, but felt a shiver crawl up her spine at the look. Rezkin appeared as a lion that had just sighted his next prey, and not in a good way. Sheila interpreted the look as a different kind of hunger and smiled suggestively. Malcius cleared his throat just as another sound reached their ears.
"Do not drop that now, and hurry up! We do not have all day, you know," said a familiar voice.
Frisha and Tam's eyes widened as the late arrivals stomped onto the deck.
"Ah, I did not realize I would have the company of House Jabai. What is this? House Jarrand, too, I see."
Malcius bowed low, as did Pallas and Brant.
"Lord Tyrion,"
Malcius intoned.
"I did not know we would be traveling with such esteemed company."
His eyes glanced at Rezkin, who was mostly blocked by the others. He was pointedly not bowing. Malcius added,
"Or rather, additional esteemed company, I should say."
"Additional?" Tyrion queried with a furrowed brow. His eyes fell on Rezkin as the young warrior stepped from behind the other young men. Tyrion's face paled, and his jaw dropped slightly.
"Oh, I see. Lord Reskin," he sputtered as he bowed slightly in greeting. "It is, good to see you again."
Malcius glanced between the two, his interest piqued by the superior lord's strange behavior.
"You two already know each other?"
He immediately thought better of his question and waved it off.
"Of course you do. Introductions are not necessary."
Reskin greeted Lord Tyrion, wearing the same feral smile from a moment ago, only it looked decidedly more dangerous when directed at the Duke's eldest son. His other prey had arrived. Reskin had seen the Duke's request for passage for his son and had taken it upon himself to assign the young man to their ship. He had also sent a missive to the Duke, in the General's name, explaining the security that was already assigned to the vessel, so Tyrion had not come with his own guard. Since the Duke already had a number of men assigned to the tournament, Tyrion's personal guard would be pooled from them upon his arrival in Scutton. Tyrion and his manservant were to share the final room. It was not inappropriate for a manservant to share quarters with his master when traveling, and contrary to popular belief, many of those who served the upper houses were of lesser nobility. Tyrion's manservant was the fifth son of a minor landless noble. Tyrion gulped as he received the full brunt of Reskin's heated gaze. While Reskin played the amiable, upstanding noble for the others, he kept Tyrion firmly in his place through fear.
"So, Lord Reskin, does this mean your lovely girlfriend is around here as well?"
Reskin's grin lost its edge, and suddenly became as bright and pleasant as it had with the others. He brushed off Sheila's grasp and turned abruptly. With a sweeping motion, he presented Frisha. "Yes, you are quite right. My sweet Lady Frisha is attending the tournament as well, escorted by her cousins, of course." All eyes turned to the startled young woman, and she blushed at Reskin's recognition of her as his girlfriend once again. Sheila's jaw dropped.
"She's your girlfriend?"
The young lady's shocked inquiry was accentuated by a shrill whistle and the sudden rocking of the ship as it began drifting away from the dock. On sure feet, Reskin strode over to the stunned Frisha and took her in his arms as he gazed longingly into her eyes. Somehow, the performance did not seem as difficult as he thought it would be. Reskin had spent some of his time in Kybane studying the interactions between men and women. He even attended a few stage performances during the night that were classified as romances. The exchanges seemed strange and foreign, but he was practiced at mimicking behavior, so he was confident he could pull it off. How could I not be completely besotted by this stunning woman? She is a brilliant diamond in the rough. He paused theatrically. Well, I suppose it is not that rough, considering her father is a shrewd and extremely successful businessman. I am quite sure his acquired wealth exceeds many of the smaller houses, in fact. Not to mention, she is the heir of Lord Markham Jabai. Reskin intentionally referred to the general as Lord and added his family name for emphasis. Tyrion furrowed his brow. "Really? A commoner has been so successful?" "Quite," Reskin remarked. "We must not forget, gentlemen and ladies," Reskin said as he bowed slightly toward Sheila and Frisha, "that while the nobilities serve as the mind and voice of the kingdom, the commoners are the kingdom's blood. Without them, the kingdom would cease to function." Reskin then grinned smugly. "And I, for one, prefer my blood rich and plentiful." The Duke's son narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "Yet you would choose to bind yourself to one of common blood?" Reskin laughed heartily. Frisha and Tam jumped. It was the first time they had heard him laugh, and to their ears it did not quite sound genuine. "Oh, please, Tyrion," Reskin said, waving off the Lord's concern while intentionally dropping his title. "Is noble blood so weak as to be defeated by one commoner parent? Both the Count and General are as strong as any noble can be," he remarked as Malcius and Pallas straightened proudly. "Do not doubt that Lady Teresa is just as formidable and respectable." Frisha jerked her head to stare at Reskin. What did he know of her mother? Reskin stroked his jaw as he mused. Considering her father's intelligence and success, I would not be surprised to find that he was actually the remnant of a forgotten line from a minor house. Frisha frowned. She knew full well her father did not belong to any noble house. and she was sure Rezkin knew it too. All the nobles looked at Frisha appraisingly, as if seeing her for the first time. Rezkin was pleased as he observed their contemplations and lightly remarked, "It is a shame I have not been able to convince the general to accept my proposal." Sheila's jaw dropped.
"You proposed? For Frisha?"
she questioned with scorn and disbelief. The young men all scoured Rezkin's appearance, trying to process the information.
"Why would Uncle Markham reject your proposal?"
Pallas finally asked.
"He speaks so highly of you." "Alas, you have struck on the conundrum that has become the bane of my existence,"
he said dramatically with a heavy sigh. He shook his head and continued,
"I can tell you for certain that Markham definitely recognizes his niece's worth. Perhaps he is holding out for someone more active in the court. Perhaps a duke,"
he mentioned offhandedly as he waved in Tyrann's direction. The young man shifted uncomfortably, and Frisha blushed furiously.
"For all I know, he could be holding out for a prince. What I do know is that despite my promises of wealth and power and protection, he continues to deny me."
His face fell, and he looked away in heartfelt shame. Frisha placed a hand on his arm as she gazed at him sympathetically with tears in her eyes. She knew that much of what Rezkin was saying and doing was an act, but she could see his sincere distress over his rejection. Even Sheila's face softened at the young romantic's plight. Malcius shifted uncomfortably before he remarked,
"The general is a cunning man, Rez. Perhaps he only hopes to test your resolve."
Sheila scowled at her brother as she elbowed him in the ribs. Prompted by his aggressive sister, he continued,
"I'm positive it has nothing to do with you personally, and I'm sure that any house would be elated to join with you."
Sheila gave her brother a pointed look, and he added casually, "My own included." Frisha sent Malcius a dark look, and he winced as Sheila smiled smugly. Rezkin turned back to the group as he gathered his composure. He pretended not to catch Malcius's implication.
"Yes, you are probably correct, Malcius."
He straightened proudly and gripped his doublet over his heart as he said,
"I shall remain steadfast and determined. The general may yet change his mind."
Rezkin glanced over at Captain Jimson, who had been standing not far away eavesdropping on the conversation while presumably reviewing paperwork. The warrior had not informed Jimson of his plans, and Jimson really had no idea what Rezkin was up to with this whole charade. The captain recognized a signal when he saw one, though. Rezkin's look was his cue to interrupt the conversation.
"Lords, ladies, now that we are underway, the ship's captain asks that we all meet on the quarterdeck for instructions in safety and ship's protocol. If you would please follow me," Jimson said as he turned and led the way.
Captain Krausen spent nearly an hour explaining the layout of the ship, a bit of sailing terminology, and what everyone should do in the case of an emergency. To the men he explained where they should take up positions if the ship came under attack. Being a passenger ship rather than a warship, the Carrack had little in the way of defenses. Most of the space that would be used for weaponry had been designed as quarters for the crew and passengers. The captain explained that there had been no attacks for as long as he had been sailing the Tremedal, but he wanted to be thorough. During his speech, the captain also made it quite clear exactly who was in charge while they were on the ship. Tyrann and Malcius sniffed in disdain, but Rezkin piped in with exuberance, assuring the captain that everyone understood the need for certain protocols when on the vessel. Chastened, the young man nodded their assurances as well. In the short time Rezkin had been in the presence of the nobles, he had effectively manipulated them into viewing him as the leader. He left open the implication that he was of very high standing without ever divulging his house affiliation, not a small feat among nobles. General Markham's assurances had gone a long way in generating that trust with the Jabais. Rezkin wondered just how hard the general choked on his words when he issued such praise. Rezkin had successfully cowed the Duke's son through fear during their previous encounter, but the Jabai's assumption of Rezkin's superior status encouraged Tyrann to believe the same. Tyrann simply assumed the Jabais knew with whom they were traveling. Gaining control over the traveling party was only one part of Rezkin's plan, though. He could have done so through a number of different methods. The easiest would have been to simply state that the general had placed him in command and left them to wonder as to his status in the hierarchy of the kingdom. That would have done nothing to further his second goal, though, which was to aid Frisha. If Rezkin could rewrite the opinions of the young nobles of houses Jabai, Gerund, and especially Neris, then Frisha would have a much higher chance of being accepted as an equal in high society. If Rezkin could not keep Frisha for himself, then he could at least help her make a smooth entrance into society and hopefully have a happier life. Rezkin's third goal was to create an acceptable persona for himself. The general was a prime example of how suspicion and fear could turn others against him, and people feared what they did not understand. If Rezkin acted as himself, the others on this voyage would be distrustful and could turn against him. He could have played the role of a commoner and been effectively invisible, but then he would have had a difficult time guiding events according to his plans. Most people seemed to want to believe he was a noble, so he decided to let them believe as they wished. Surprisingly, allowing people to believe he had the utmost power and authority was the path of least resistance. Besides, the young warrior would need a strongly defined and accepted persona if his plans for the tournament were to succeed. For the rest of the day, people mingled and chatted. The nobles gossiped about court and courtships. They even invited Frisha to join them when Rezkin was not present. Captain Jimson spent some time getting to know his comrades, and the House Jabai Guard kept to themselves playing dice or bones. Tam found a secluded spot near the poop deck to read his book. He was feeling out of sorts. His friends all seemed to fit into some niche, and he did not belong with any of them. Only Raylan was in a similar position, and he was not yet desperate enough to suffer her. Tam knew that Rezkin was playing a role, although he still did not understand why. The problem was that Tam was unable to discern how much of what Rezkin said was simple acting and how much was truth. Rezkin's speech about commoners was both complimentary and patronizing, and Tam did not know how to feel about it. On the surface, Rezkin's affable and joyous conduct seemed normal for a sociable noble, but the excessive jubilance and decorum seemed almost neurotic for Rezkin. The warrior was typically defined by a solid, stoic presence that incited feelings of safety and stability. When Rezkin was around, Tam always felt like everything was under control, even when they were in the midst of chaos. The Lord Rezkin simply did not fill him with the same sense of assurance, even though he knew it lay just below the surface. Rezkin's almost passionate behavior somehow disturbed him. Raylan was just as aloof as Tam. She seemed particularly uncomfortable around the other women. Frisha had gained points with Raylan when she snubbed Sheila, but now Frisha was spending more time with the nobles, as was Rezkin. Raylan was astonished by Rezkin's behavior. Never had she imagined he was capable of pulling off such a flamboyant persona. It made her wonder about Rezkin's other capabilities and why he was such a skilled fraudster. Just who was Rezkin, really, and could he be useful? Raylan still was not happy that Rezkin proposed to Frisha, but she was encouraged by the fact that the deal had failed. She did feel bad for him, but he was a strong man and he would get over it. Frisha was too weak for a man like Rezkin. Raylan could tell that he was put off by women like Sheila and thought that she, as a warrior, had a much better chance with such a man. If only she could get him away from Frisha long enough for him to see her. Rezkin disappeared for a while as he secretly scrambled about the ship. He snuck about the captain's quarters, since the captain was busy on deck. He had already been there before, but he wanted to make sure there was nothing new of which he should be aware. There was not, so he continued with his search. He snuck into each of the guests' rooms and rifled through their trunks, and then went through the mound of useless necessities in the cargo hold. Nothing of immediate import stood out, but he did find a few tidbits that he would file away for later use. 2 of the Jabai house guards had gambling debts they were to pay off by performing some unspecified service while in Scutton. The future Duke, Tyrion, was to attend a clandestine meeting on behalf of his father with a man whose name Rezkin did not recognize. Tyrion's manservant, Colton, had a secret lover who Rezkin was nearly certain was a man. Sheila was not as innocent as she would have her family believe. She had in her possession half a dozen parting letters from potential suitors, moaning about how much they would miss her, and 2 actually pleaded for her to meet them for a private rendezvous while at the tournament. When Rezkin rejoined the nobles, everyone wanted to know what he had been up to and how he managed to disappear for so long on a ship. Rezkin laughed and said, Well, you see, I do enjoy a good voyage as much as the rest of you, but we did have to rise hours before dawn this morning." Frisha arched a brow. She knew full well that Rezkin always rose long before dawn. The man was incessantly restless when he was not moving in some fashion. Malcius snickered. "You snuck off to take a nap." Rezkin heaved an overly dramatic sigh and uttered, "You may have seen the truth, and I concede. I feel no shame for my absence." Sheila, not deterred by Rezkin's intentions toward Frisha, said,
"Oh, I wish you had said so earlier. I might have felt inclined to take a nap as well."
She fluttered her lashes and eyed him suggestively. Malcius scowled. "Sheila, know you no shame?" Brant chuckled. "Whatever vessel held her shame grew so full it shattered. She is no longer capable of carrying any."
"What would you know of shame, Brant?" Sheila scoffed. "You are a cad."
"Better a cad than a— Ow!" Brant shouted as Malcius stomped his foot under the table. "Yes, well," Rezkin cleared his throat. "It is probably best I found myself in seclusion. Tam tells me I snore quite loudly." Malcius groaned. "And I am to bunk with you?" Rezkin shrugged and grinned. "Every man must have at least one fault, no?" "If that is your only fault, then you are a better man than the rest of us," Malcius muttered. "Speak for yourself," said Brant. "I am out of perfection," he remarked facetiously as he ran a hand through his long, silky hair. Pallas punched Brant in the arm and replied, "Yeah, perfect for using as a practice dummy." Brant sniffed and said, "You laugh now, but I'm going to beat you in the tournament." Pallas barked a laugh and said, "You would be lucky to make it into the same tier as me." "I placed high enough in the spring tournament," Brant defended. "Only because most of us were stuck at the field training our uncle insisted upon," Pallas remarked. Rezkin arched a brow. "Field training?" Brant rolled his eyes and answered, "The general got it in his head that we should all know how to survive in the wild, just in case. Luckily, I got to leave early to participate in the tournament." Malcius added, "It was supposed to be survival training for young lords, but try telling a bunch of nobles to leave their finery at home. Everyone had massive tents and soft cots, wine and bread and cheese aplenty. It was more like a 3-week social gathering. Uncle Markham was furious." "You were there with the rest of us," Brant chided. Malcius shrugged. "I admit it. I like my fine things and prefer to live in comfort. Besides, it was ridiculous. When would we ever need such skills? It is not like we go wandering off into the wild. We live in the city, and we travel by ship or in a caravan of coaches and guards with people to see to our needs. I do not see why I need to know how to trap a rabbit or build a fire pit." Frisha, who had been very quiet up until now, straightened and lifted her chin.
"Rezkin can do all of those things. He's quite the skilled woodsman."
Rezkin gave her a warning glance, but she ignored it and continued.
"When we traveled the river before, much like now," she emphasized, "we encountered a problem with a massive gang of bandits. We were forced to abandon the ship and travel by land for a week with not much more than a single pack each. Rezkin and the soldiers hunted for food, set up camps, and battled the bandits. Rezkin even treated the soldiers' wounds afterward. What do you think you could do if the ship went down and you lost all of your finery?"
Mouths were agape all around, and Frisha felt a small satisfaction with the noble's loss of composure. Eyes darted back and forth between Frisha and Rezkin. Rezkin cocked his head and studied Frisha curiously. It was interesting that when she finally gathered enough courage to speak with conviction, it was to do so in his favor. Malcius recovered first and waved off Frisha's claim. Yes, but you had the soldiers with you to take care of things, and killing a few bandits can hardly be considered a battle." Frisha scowled.
"There were several dozen bandits and only 6 soldiers. Tam and I had no weapons training at the time, and we were pretty much useless. Rezkin was magnificent, though,"
she said, as she took a note from Sheila's book and batted her lashes at him. Frisha had not really seen much of the battle, actually. She was too busy trying to keep the panic at bay, her eyes darting in every direction, seemingly all at once. She had picked up bits and pieces of the discussions between the soldiers and Jimson afterward, though. She knew Rezkin had been quite impressive, but did not know to what extent. Besides, she continued, that was only the first time we battled with bandits. The others were a mixture of confused and impressed, but Tyrion was terrified. He had seen the look of death in Rezkin's eyes when they first met in Kybane, and now he knew for certain that Rezkin was no stranger to bloodshed. Rezkin suddenly laughed boisterously and waved away the serious mood. You know I can never seem to sit still for long. I'm always picking up some new hobby. I suppose I have acquired an odd assortment of skills here and there. Woodcraft can actually be quite intriguing and relaxing, you know. The General may be onto something, if not for the reasons you think. You can never understand the value of what you gain by depending only on yourself unless you have tried it. Things are different when you do not have servants looking after you. After you dispel such a weakness, I am telling you, the confidence you gain is simply intoxicating. Malcius raised his brows. You think having servants is a weakness? Not having them, needing them, Rezkin replied, holding up a finger for emphasis. For me, servants are a luxury, a right of status, wealth and power, but they are not a necessity. I can survive without them if necessary, Rezkin stated with smug pride. I guess I see your point, Malcius replied. He rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably. To tell the truth, I do not know what I would do if I were put in such a position that I needed to fend for myself. I cannot honestly say that I would survive, he added with a bit of chagrin. Pallas and Tyrion shifted uncomfortably, each knowing they would fail under the same circumstances. Sheila, however, had caught on to a different strand of Frisha's story. So, cousin, am I to understand that you travelled for weeks alone with a host of men? Her tone was light, but filled with accusation. Frisha lifted her chin and replied, That's right. Tam was my escort. He's like a brother to me, and he swore an oath of protection to my father. Besides, Rezkin was providing his protection as well. She left out the fact that she had only met Rezkin part-way through the journey, and had really known nothing about him. Yes, well, Master Tamrin is not your brother. He is not related to you in any way, and the oath of a commoner means nothing to me, she replied with disdain. Then I suppose I am fortunate that your opinion means nothing to me, Frisha replied acerbically. Besides, would you question Rezkin's honor as well? Sheila huffed. Of course not, but it is obvious you have done something to catch his attention. I cannot imagine any other reason he would want someone like you. Rezkin stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. He towered over Sheila with a disapproving gaze. It lacked violence, but held the scorn of a father scolding a child. Lady Sheila, I take offense to your accusations and slander against my lady's character. Lady Frisha is and has always been a respectable woman, and she should be commended for her bravery and dignity during such trying times. You have made a number of unfounded assumptions. I also take offense in your comments against Master Tamrin, who I have the honor of calling friend. It matters not that you would question his honor, since from what I have seen, you seem to have very little. Unlike you, I actually know Master Tamrin, and I hold his oath in high regard. If you must belittle others to make yourself feel better, then you should do so silently, in your own mind, where only you will suffer from your poison. You will certainly abstain from speaking such vileness in my presence. Rezkin held out his hand and said, Come, Frisha. Please join me on deck for some fresh air. If you have enjoyed this audiobook, let us know. Take a quick moment to rate and review it on Audible, so we know we're bringing you audiobooks you'll love.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.